Welcome to this discussion of Opera North's new concert staging of Beethoven's only opera, Fidelio. My name's Stuart Leeks, and I'm delighted to be joined for this talk by the soprano Rachel Nicholls, who sings the role of Leonore, otherwise known as Fidelio, in the opera, by the tenor Toby Spence, who sings the role of Florestan, by the director Matthew Eberhardt, and by Martin Pickard of Opera North's music staff. Now, this performance of Fidelio is being conducted by Mark Wigglesworth, and it's being live streamed from Leeds Town Hall on Saturday the 12th of December, which is actually just a few days before the probable date of Beethoven's birth in December 1770, so almost exactly 250 years ago to the day. I think it's probably fair to say that opera, like many things in Beethoven's life and career, wasn't something that came easily to him. The premiere of Fidelio took place in November 1805, which was just a few months after the premiere of one of his most famous works, his revolutionary Eroica Symphony. But it took another 9 years for Fidelio to reach its final form, the form in which it's most frequently performed today. And although we're hopefully going to come on to talk a little bit about why this feels like such a special piece to be doing at this present moment, I thought it might be useful to start off by just situating it a little bit in the context of its own time. So I'm going to ask Martin if you could perhaps just introduce the piece to us and tell us a little bit about the circumstances in which it was created and the sorts of influences that were at play on Beethoven at the time.
Yes, Stuart, you're right that things didn't come easy to Beethoven. He was a kind of grafter in a way as a composer. He worked very hard. And I think opera in particular, there's actually a letter from him to one of his librettists, I think while he was working on the final version of Fidelio, saying opera is such hard work, I'm going to earn a martyr's crown for my work on this piece. And this was a man who'd already written 8 symphonies, was a hugely successful composer. I think there are several reasons why it took a while for it to reach its final form, some of which were to do with him, his personality and his kind of style of work, but some of which were to do with external events. Because we're in the middle of the Napoleonic period, so Napoleon is kind of marching across Europe, invading various countries. And the first performance of it, which was in 1805, unluckily coincided with Napoleon's troops occupying Vienna. So actually all Beethoven's normal kind of well-heeled aristocratic audience who would have come to see a new opera had fled town. I think they'd gone out to their country residences or to the spa towns around. So it played to rather empty houses. This was in the autumn of 1805, I think. He then had a chance to revive it at the beginning of the next year, 1806, at which point he did make revisions to it. I mean, we haven't got time to go into detail now, but one of the things he did at that point was that he cut it down from 3 acts to 2. So the original form of it, Florestan, interestingly, doesn't appear until Act 3. So Toby, if we were doing that version, would have to wait through 2 whole acts before he sings his first note, whereas in the final form, he only has to wait through 1. That performance, that production actually went very well, I think, but Beethoven, again, this is a case of him in a way being his own worst enemy. He got into a dispute with the theatre about royalties. So in the end, there weren't as many performances of that as there could have been because he withdrew it. Fast forward several years to 1814, still in Vienna, and the great Congress of Vienna is about to start, which is the great international conference that settled or tried to settle what to do with Europe now that Napoleon had been defeated. In fact, Napoleon kind of flickered back into life a year later and we had the Battle of Waterloo and so on. But at that point, it looked as if Napoleon had been defeated. This great congress was setting up in Vienna, which had a huge cultural program alongside. Beethoven was sailing high as a composer. I think he'd had his seventh and eighth symphonies performed. And he was then asked, I think slightly to surprise, well, why don't you revive that opera that we last heard in 1806? So he sat down and made some more revisions to it. And that became the piece that we now have. And that was really a pretty big success straight from the start. I don't think the initial run was that long for other external reasons, but the piece kind of took off and went international quite soon. You asked about the kind of style of the piece, Stuart. Shall I just say a few words about that, about the kind of models of the piece? I mean, in a way, it's very influenced by the kind of French opera that was going on around then, in a form called opéra comique, which doesn't mean that it's comic, but it does mean that it has dialogue. It's very much a mixture of speech and song. And although you can see traces of the German Singspiel tradition, something like the Magic Flute, which has a mixture of dialogue and music, the Beethoven opera feels in a way closer to the French model for several reasons. One is that it's very political, because I think a lot of the opera comique that coming out of Paris reflected the French Revolution, the terror after the French Revolution, and so on. But there are also kind of stylistic reasons for it feeling slightly like a French opera. There are a lot of ensembles, for instance. It's very striking. I was also sitting in that rehearsal on Saturday, which was wonderful, by the way. Thank you very much. Thinking, yes, there are great arias in this piece, but actually there are also, it seems to be quite a high proportion of duets, trios, choruses, and things like that. So it's very much a piece about the collective, as well as having this fantastic love story at the center of it, which is all about the love between Leonore and Florestan. So I think for those reasons as well, because it combined those two things, this very personal story and this political public message, that's very, very much Beethoven. I think you see that through his whole life, his letters and everything. He's fascinated by politics, but he's also a man who in his personal life, I think, longed for a kind of rather unfulfilled family happiness, which he never quite achieved. So it feels a very personal piece.
Thanks, Martin. That's really fascinating, and I think that relationship in the piece between the public and the private is absolutely key, and also in a sense what makes it such a powerful and moving work. And you mentioned there the personal story that's really at the heart of it, the relationship between Leonore and her husband Florestan. So I'm really interested to get your perspectives on those characters and on that relationship, Rachel and Toby. I know you've both sung these roles before, so I'm guessing you've got to know these people quite well. So I wonder if you can give us your personal perspectives on them, and also from a slightly more technical point of view, how are they to sing in terms of that particular challenge? Rachel, perhaps you could start off.
I believe that I'm a little bit rare in that I'm somebody who actually really, really enjoys singing Beethoven. A lot of singers have spoken to me about how they feel that Beethoven writes a little bit too high, too long, and now the way that Beethoven is cast at the moment, with quite big dramatic voices sometimes, means that there's sometimes technical challenges to do with singing Beethoven. But for the first 15 years of my career, I was primarily a Baroque specialist, and I love singing Beethoven because for me, I'm able to reawaken my enormous enthusiasm for historical performance and authentic music making, and use a lot of the colours in my palette from my early music days, which I think are the ones well, I hope that Beethoven would have wanted. He wrote the role of Leonore for a soprano called Anna Milder, who also premiered Schubert's Shepherd on the Rock. She was a very, very interesting lady. She was, I believe, only 19 or 20 when she first sang the first incarnation of Leonore, and she in fact premiered all 3 versions for Beethoven. She was described as having a voice the size of a house, quite notably. I'm not quite sure what that means, but she obviously had a voice of enormous power, but enormous beauty, and she was also obviously able to fine it down in order to sing the coloratura in Shepherd on the Rock, and in fact in the first incarnation of Leonore, which is even more technically athletic than the current version. So in terms of the singing, I, of course, find Beethoven enormously challenging, but I absolutely love it. And while Beethoven may not have felt he was an instinctive and natural composer of opera, he was really, really good at orchestras. And the enormous pleasure of being part of that orchestral texture, and to take that into the ensembles and be part of an ensemble texture, for me is terrifically exciting. But the other thing that I feel about this opera, particularly in terms of the character of Leonore and her musical and narrative journey through the piece, is an enormous sense of integrity. And I think it has both in terms of the music and in terms of the character. Leonore is a heroine without being, she's not pious. She's genuinely a good person who is trying to do her best. And we've been speaking a lot in the rehearsal room about how her innate goodness ripples out and touches other members of the cast, other people involved in the opera, and how that shining star of hope which she has from the beginning to the end, that she will be able to rescue Florestan, affects everybody in the opera in enormously positive ways.
Shall I pick up on that? I didn't hear the beginning of Martin's talk earlier on, so I might repeat one or two things. I hope I don't. But I'm like Rachel, also very aware of the history and the inception of this piece when I think about Florestan, because of course, you know, with over 200 years now of this piece, or nearly 200 years of this piece being in the repertory. It's experienced that thing which is casting inflation, where the voices that take the role seem to get bigger and bigger. And I think if composers heard it now, in the way it's often cast, they wouldn't really recognize the type of voices that are used to sing their opera. And so, I mean, I haven't got the heaviest of voices, and I tried to sing it as lyrically and as beautifully as I think it is written to be. And I think there's that beauty and nobility of spirit in both Leonore and Florestan, which is probably, you know, in Britain's, sorry, when I say Britain, I mean Beethoven. In Beethoven's humanism, that's probably right in terms of his way of setting a drama. I think in terms of telling the story, he chose a play on which to base his one opera that was more about humanity, the people. There's less action. There is less story within this play. And as Martin said, you know, he hung the bones of it on models that he had from elsewhere, from France. But I also think that I hear so much of the magic flute in this piece ringing around it. When he wrote the piece, he was living in the Theater an der Wien. Sonnleitner, I hope I'm not repeating things now, but Sonnleitner, who was the librettist, had taken over from Schickenader as the person who was responsible for the theatre, and gave Beethoven a place to write and work and to live during this time. And I'm pretty sure the Magic Flute, being the sort of the blockbuster of the theatre, would have been rattling around in the rafters, if not on the stage at the time when he was writing it. And you can hear that in the key structure even. And at the very end, because it's a humanist play, you don't get a deus ex machina like you do in conventions prior to this time, but you do get a scene with Don Fernando as if there were Deus Ex Machina, and the key structure of that C major is exactly the same, and in fact it sounds almost identical to the Magic Flute. But there are many, many other examples. The moment where Leonore hands him some bread in the second act. There is this really strong, and I cannot put my finger on exactly what it is, but it does feel like the second quintet in the Magic Flute. But apart from that, yeah, when we've been staging it, when we've been looking at how to tell this story, we've been thinking more along lines of character, because we can't interact, we can't touch, we have to keep a distance between us in order to be safe and to follow guidelines. And so what we're doing is projecting the story as we think them, and that seems to go very much with the way that Beethoven sets a narrative, that it is about feeling, and Beethoven's music is all about feeling, and digging into that is where we found the fruit. There you go.
Thanks very much, Toby. Fascinating what you're both saying about the goodness of and integrity of both of those characters, and how it sort of radiates out from them. I think particularly of a character like Rocco in the opera The Jailer, who in a sense is in a more ambiguous position than most people are, most of the characters in the piece. So very interesting to sort of hear that and think about the influence that particularly Leonore has on him. And Toby, you were mentioning there obviously the circumstances in which the piece is being rehearsed and performed at the moment, and I'd like to turn to Matthew. To talk a little bit more about that. As I said, this is a concert staging, which is a particular, an Opera North has a particular approach to that term, going back for a few years now. So Matthew, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that term implies, and also probably more importantly, how you've approached it in terms of staging this piece. I think it's probably important to sort of preface it by saying that actually the intention originally was that these were going to be performances for a live audience, and then for the circumstances we all know very well that hasn't been possible to happen, and so we also have the added complexity of cameras being present for the performance as well. So a lot on your plate, Matthew, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's tremendously exciting. I mean, these concert stagings are always very thrilling, and I think one of the key reasons for that is that bringing the orchestra out from the pit where they would normally be in a normal theatre context and placing them on the stage. And just following on from what Rachel was saying about how exciting it is to be part of that orchestral texture. Visually, we absolutely get that in this context. Normally they'll be buried. And when you see your orchestra on stage and you see the kind of physical energy that those players put into playing this kind of music, that absolutely has, it's tremendously important and gives a huge amount of dramatic energy, as well as just a sort of fantastic sound. And sort of following on from that, the other person who you have access to, you would normally not have so much access to, is the conductor. And we're very lucky to have Mark working with us on this, who is fantastic. And as a director, you're always very aware of the conductor. I mean, they are like another sort of character, really. That their understanding of the scene and how they conduct, of course, shapes the sort of dramatic performance. So it's sort of fantastic to be able to take that character, as it were, and actually place them sort of within the visual context of what we're seeing, rather than them sort of being sort of, hidden away. And I think what that releases is a glorious act of music making. I mean, there is always great music making happening when you're doing these pieces in a theatre, but I guess we put it in a little sort of proscenium arch frame, and we sort of hide the orchestra a bit and the conductor sort of down at the bottom. But within this context, all those forces are kind of placed in one space, and allows it to interact. And I think just with the kind of piece that Fidelio is, the textures of it and how brave it is and visceral, I think that really, doing a concert staging really helps kind of show all of those elements working together. The other thing, yes, you mentioned the cameras. I mean, what's interesting about doing these concert stagings is, again, in a sort of normal opera house context, there is always a gap between the audience and the singers, which is hole in the ground where the pit is. There's always a distance, and what's amazing about these is there is no distance at all. The singers are the closest thing to you. You'll never get closer to them than you will do in these concert stagings. And of course, when you're actually in the building, I mean, we're doing this in Leeds Town Hall, which is a glorious building in itself, and the idea of taking that building over to put an opera on is really exciting. But even with doing it with cameras, what's amazing about cameras is they can get close. And what we've been saying so far about sort of the private and the public aspects of the piece, you know, that I think is really going to sort of play to our hands in terms of the event being filmed, because cameras can do close, and they can be right with the singers, but also they can do public, they can do Leeds Town Hall, and we can see the building in all its glory. So hopefully this, the way this is being presented, I think is going to work really well for the piece. And the other thing I'll just pick up on, as Toby sort of mentioned earlier, you know, there is very little for singers to have. I mean, there are no props, there's very little costume. And because this piece is about people, it's about people with other people and also people in solitude. So that sort of difference between being around people in public and being by yourself in isolation, again, a sort of a concert staging sort of highlights that structurally within the piece, which again, I think plays into what Beethoven was trying to do with Fidelio.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And in a sense, a sort of similar question to you, Rachel and Toby, you know, about the concert staging format. I wonder to what extent you feel more exposed, I suppose, in that format, and also whether the presence of cameras actually does have an effect on the performance, on the dynamics of the performance that you give from your points of view. Again, Rachel, maybe you could start us off with this.
I think for me, what the cameras will capture, because they can, as Matthew said, they can be very, very close, they can be further away. What they will capture is honest feeling. And for me, when I'm working my way through a piece, whether it's on the stage or whether it's on a concert platform, and I've been fortunate enough to do a lot of concert performances of opera, and I believe that's an enormous privilege because of the amount of attention we are able to give to the music. And as we've said, this exciting element of being in the middle of the orchestra there's just nothing like it. But what I would say is, when I'm feeling my way through my narrative of an opera, I don't really notice things like cameras or audience. It's just about my train of thought through the opera and the way I interact with the other characters on the stage. So I would say, although there is nowhere to hide in this kind of performance, and you could feel very exposed without being able to, in a sense, hide behind your props and your costume and your wig, I think it makes almost no difference to me at all. And it's an enormous act of trust between us and Matthew and the people making the film, that they're going to capture what we do, and that we simply have to trust that our feeling and our embodiment of that feeling of creating the emotions and the tensions and the relationships between the characters is going to read. And it is an enormous act of trust, but it's terrifically exciting too.
Hi. Yes, I feel the same way. I find filmed operas can be good, but there are limitations to it, and also singers, when they're close up in the camera lens, don't look their best, let's say. It can all, you know, the sort of the visceral quality of what it is to sing in a theatre can come through the lens in a not terribly attractive way. But what we're focusing on here is, again, the feeling, and wonderful thing about concert performance is the stillness of it. And so we can really focus on the sound and on creating a sort of almost recording quality performance of the piece. So there's that. The other thing is that what I think audiences aren't able to appreciate is that what we see from the stage is so different from what they see. We have no concept of what they see. And I've done performances before. I remember, doing a Così fan tutte the first time it went out, and then going and seeing it when it was revived with another cast, something like 10 years later, and had no idea that I was watching the same production that I had been in. It looked and felt so different. And so when you look out from the stage, you just see blackness. You can't even see the cameras. And in fact, little note to Matthew, if we could in some way have a white tape, or if someone with a camera could have some sort of white thing on their jumper so we know that where they are, so that we know not to look at them when it comes to the performance, that would be great. But that's my feeling.
That's really fascinating. I think that you were talking about there actually looking out at sort of just darkness, and from my perspective, looking at you, as it were, on Saturday, that extraordinary moment at the beginning of Act 2, where you have that, what sounds, it is a quite extraordinary emotional journey you go on just within the context of that one aria that you have at the beginning of Act 2. But thinking about this man in darkness, in isolation, having no idea whether he's, how much longer indeed he has to live, that felt like an extraordinarily sort of powerful and resonant moment just now for us. And, of course, all does end in the end happily, and the closing chorus is just such an extraordinary sort of sonic moment of complete jubilation. So it did feel to me very much on Saturday, this feels like a tremendously sort of significant piece to be doing at this moment in all of our lives. So very personal question really to you, to Rachel, Toby and Matthew, about, for you, bringing this piece to the stage at this moment. How does that feel for you at the end of what has been an extraordinarily difficult year for everyone, and not least for musicians, of course? Again, Rachel, perhaps you could start us off.
Well, even when there seems to be almost no hope at all, you can find a tiny little glimmer, and you can build on that, and you can use it to find your inner strength to carry on. I think Leonore has a big lesson for all of us there. It has been a very difficult year. The word that keeps coming up in our discussion, that keeps resonating with me, is this isolation. I think people are very isolated. I think people are very frightened. But one of the things that this pandemic has taught me is the sheer amount of community spirit and goodness that there is. I'm constantly delighted, amazed by how supportive everybody in our profession is of everybody else, and how we're trying to look out for each other. And also in my local community as well. I spend usually 6 to 9 months of the year away, usually abroad. And being at home for this year has shown me how much people in my road really do care about each other. So in all sorts of ways, the pandemic is isolating us, but it is also meaning that we are really genuinely reaching out in a very positive way to look after each other. And I think if we can just hang on to that and all work together, we will beat this thing. And I think Leonore's lesson is very, very apt, that even when you feel that there is almost nothing to carry on for, you can find the strength to do it. And I think the message of Fidelio could not be more right for these times.
Thank you. Toby?
Yes, I fully agree with that, and I think that's very well put. In the music at the top of the second act, the sort of prelude to the aria that Florestan has, which is a beautiful depiction of darkness, but darkness of the soul as well as darkness in the atmosphere. I feel that that Beethoven drew a lot from Haydn in that music there, from the overture, the opening to the creation. That's a depiction of chaos. And I think that if you want to hear a sonic or musical representation of the sort of chaos that we've all been plunged into this year, and take solace and understanding from that, this is a great piece for that. I also think that the escape or the emancipation that Beethoven was writing into this piece, or the quality of being a prisoner, was very much related to his deafness that was sinking into him at the time of writing this. He was beginning to experience it from the age of 23. And I think that, like all the best music, draws out that very personal autobiography from him, which is, again, with Beethoven, that sense of direct feeling that he imbues the piece with. I was watching an interview, Stravinsky talking to Robert Kraft, and he claimed that Beethoven used to write with a pencil in his mouth, which he would put on the top of the piano as he bashed the piano. He was a very physical player, apparently, to feel the music. And that, Beethoven's quality has that visceral, very direct, beyond the ears, but corporal sensation about it. And this is another reiteration of that quality that he has.
Yeah, really, just to follow up really on what Rachel and Toby have said. I mean, it's interesting, if you'd asked that question, Stuart, about how we relate to the piece sort of 5 months ago, it would have all been about Florestan being, because we were so isolated, especially during that first lockdown period. I guess what's amazing about the piece is it shows us how we come out of that situation, which is sort of feels really useful now. So probably right now I'm less Florestan in the cell, but I'm more sort of Act 2 finale with Christmas coming up, feeling more joyful and looking at what the future holds. But I guess personally, one thing that has really struck me working on this is, Rachel's put it very well already, but the power that Leonore has on the world around her, and this idea that, the power of one individual to change their context is really striking in the piece. And I think, right now, certainly personally, that's very much how I feel, that, we're all in a very difficult situation, but we all have an individual responsibility to help those around us and help the world that we live in, and to move forwards in whatever way we can. So I think, that sort of, the power of a person to affect change has felt quite striking to me in the last few weeks.
Yeah, very interesting, Toby, you were mentioning Stravinsky there, because I think he has a wonderful phrase about Beethoven, which he says that Beethoven is contemporary forever. And I think that feels to me particularly apt for this piece. And Martin, it is interesting, isn't it, how in its sort of subsequent history, particularly in the 20th century, Fidelio has been chosen as a piece to be performed at really kind of convulsive moments of sort of political or social change.
Yes, I think particularly in the German-speaking world, I mean, it was in 1945, it was the first opera performed in Berlin after the fall of Hitler. So it was performed in September 1945 by what's now called the Deutsche Oper Berlin, as it were, in the rubble of Berlin, as a kind of symbolic act of looking ahead. I think in Vienna, after they didn't actually rebuild their opera house, the Staatsoper, till 1955, but they opened that with Fidelio. But the one I remember from my lifetime was actually in the GDR, actually, East Germany. In 1989, that state, and there are several ironies at work here, that state was celebrating its 40th anniversary. And the opera in Dresden, the Semperoper, programmed Fidelio. But what they didn't know, rather, like us with this pandemic creeping up on us, is that by the time they got to October of 1989, which was the date of the anniversary, the people would be on the streets screaming for more liberty and effectively screaming for the downfall of that state. So the show opened in October 1989. So this is just a month before the Berlin Wall came down. And Christina Mielitz, who was the director, in the final scene, had the chorus wear street clothes, their normal street clothes. So they came on looking exactly like the people who were demonstrating on the streets outside. So I think people have found extraordinary kind of very, very immediate resonances in this, in the way that the three other speakers have just said. So, let's see what resonances it will have in 10 years' time. I think it's a piece that responds extraordinarily to everything that's going on around us, mainly because the themes in it are very eternal. I think we've already touched on their themes of liberty and depression, but they're also the themes of love and the small scale liberty that you can have. You can escape from your entrapment through relationships in a way. I think that's one of the messages of the piece. So let's hope there will be good reasons to be playing this piece again in 10 years' time.
I'm sure there will. And I'm going to finish with what's probably the hardest question of all, which is to ask each of you to choose a favourite moment from the piece for us to all look and listen out for when we're live streaming or subsequently watching the performance. Rachel, again, perhaps we could start with you.
Well, I'm torn. I can't pick one. I've got two. So Toby's representation of chaos, culminating in Florestan singing Gott welch dunkel hier, I think it's possibly the best music I know. And every single time I'm in this opera, I always have to sneak to the wings so that I can hear the Florestan's aria, because although Leonore doesn't hear it, she is imagining exactly what he is going through. Her darkest imaginings probably are about right, I would say. And for me, it's the most beautiful, poignant and incredibly moving music. And the other moment I'd like everybody to listen out for is O Gott, welch ein Augenblick, which is so beautiful when finally Leonore and Florestan in our production are able to share almost the same space. The huge emotional release and relief that music conjures up is absolutely magical. And that's near the end.
Toby.
I agree with Rachel on both those scores, and I would say that the beautiful paean to hope that you get at the end, the sort of hymn of all the most beautiful music in the world, but also the wonderful dignity and nobility. There's this quality that Beethoven in his genius gives to the whole piece, and that is that you hear the most complex music in the arias. And in the, as Martin touched on, in the ensembles, you hear, it's sort of because of the greater forces, because of the need to get the different stories across, you hear more clarity, and therefore you hear more simplicity. That very much reflects the way we interact anyway in life, that we reserve the most complex feelings for ourselves, and we show to the world a simpler version of ourselves. And I love that quality that Beethoven absolutely gets, but also the incredible nobility with which he imbues Leonore in her incredible Act 1 aria, with the horns, which leave us in no doubt that she's the hero of the piece.
Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I think my top three have been taken already. I mean, there's all glorious moments there. I'll do a slightly alternative one, which there's a trio at the midpoint of Act 1, where I really feel like the narrative sort of just completely kicks in sort of up a gear. Rocco has just sort of said to Fidelio that he's going to speak to the governor about allowing Fidelio to help him with sort of extra duties within the prison. And at that point in this trio, you know, Leonore is feeling like she is one step closer towards following this sort of gut instinct that she could be about to find her husband. You know, Rocco is sort of about to, you know, hopefully receiving an ally and a sort of accomplice, and potentially a son-in-law too. And Marcelina is just seems about to might be able to marry the love of her life. And it's the way in which these three different characters sort of in their own little worlds, and the way both Beethoven sort of weaves their lines together, singing separately with asides, but also coming together on certain lines. Just the kind of structure of that I always find incredibly exciting, and sets up a sort of enormous amount of narrative potential about in terms of what's going to happen in the later parts of the opera.
Martin.
I'm going to cheat and nominate two as well, but one of them is the quartet near the beginning of the opera, Mir ist so wunderbar, and that is in another form what Matthew was just talking about. This extraordinary ability to have four different characters singing their own four different emotions simultaneously, and it's all bound into what you might think of as a kind of symphonic structure. I mean, it's a canon, you know, each voice comes in with its own tune, with the same tune rather, but singing its own story. But I think my ultimate moment is actually, chronologically, I was just thinking right near the middle of the opera, which is the prisoners' chorus when they are released from their captivity temporarily, which is the just most wonderful piece of mostly very, very quiet choral writing with lovely layering of the voices. And within that, I would almost say the most stunning piece is actually the first 10 bars or so before they even start to sing, because the orchestra comes in with this music of incredible slowness and timelessness. And yes, on one level, it is an image of them coming out into the daylight, and gradually adjusting to that. But I think we talked about the timelessness of this piece. You know, there's also something where actually time is suspended at that moment. It's the most extraordinary piece of music that could have come from anywhere in the 2 centuries since then, to be honest, as well. You know, talking in the words of Stravinsky about him being eternally contemporary. I think there's something about those 10 bars that just feels, where does this come from? It's really from somewhere beyond, and that's Beethoven for me.
Well, thank you all so much for your insights this morning. So much wonderful music to look forward to just within the couple of hours of this piece. As I said, it can be live streamed on Saturday the 12th of December at 7 o'clock, and is also available for a week beyond that as well. So thank you again all very much, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.